My name is Isabel Mendoza, and I am 69 years old. I live in a small house in the Mission District of San Francisco, California, where the fog was rolling in from the bay on that crisp October evening when my son-in-law's cruelty finally pushed me to make a decision that would change everything for our family. The autumn air carried the familiar scents of fresh tortillas from the local panaderia and the distant sound of mariachi music from Dolores Park. But inside my daughter's modern kitchen, all I could feel was the sting of humiliation that had become far too familiar over the past 2 years. "Isabel, seriously, what is this supposed to be?" David asked, poking at the plate of mole poblano I had spent the entire afternoon preparing with a look of disgust that made my stomach clench with embarrassment. "It looks like someone mixed chocolate with dirt. How do you people even eat this stuff?" I stood at the granite counter of my daughter Sophia's pristine kitchen, watching my son-in-law examine my grandmother's famous mole recipe with the kind of disdain usually reserved for spoiled food. This was the same recipe that had been passed down through 4 generations of Mendoza women, the same dish that had fed our family through celebrations and sorrows, the same sauce that had once been served in the finest restaurants in Puebla, Mexico, where my great-grandmother had learned it from the nuns at the convent of Santa Rosa. "David, please," Sophia said quietly from across the kitchen, her voice carrying that tone of exhaustion I had heard too often lately. "Mom spent all afternoon making this for us." "That's exactly my point," David replied, setting down his fork with theatrical flourish. "Who spends 6 hours making something that tastes like this? Isabel, I've told you before, we eat normal food in this house. American food, food that doesn't require a dictionary to pronounce." The words hit me like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to wound. Normal food. American food. As if the culinary traditions that had sustained my family for generations were somehow inferior, somehow shameful. I looked at my daughter, hoping to see some sign of support, some indication that she would defend the culture she had grown up celebrating. Instead, Sophia stared at her plate with the kind of silence that spoke volumes about the choices she had made since marrying David 3 years ago. David Chen was a successful restaurant consultant who specialized in elevating ethnic restaurants to appeal to mainstream American palates. He was brilliant at his job, commanding high fees for transforming family-owned establishments into trendy fusion concepts that attracted younger, wealthier clientele. His success had bought Sophia and him a beautiful Victorian house in Pacific Heights, expensive cars, and the kind of lifestyle my daughter had never experienced growing up in our modest Mission District home. But David's professional success had come with a personal cost that I had watched unfold with growing horror over the past 3 years. The man who made his living by sanitizing other people's cultural authenticity had applied the same philosophy to his marriage, systematically erasing every trace of Sophia's Mexican heritage from their shared life. It had started subtly, with suggestions that Sophia speak only English in their home because it's more professional. Then came the complaints about family gatherings, which David found too loud and too chaotic. Gradually, Sophia had stopped attending quinceañeras and baptisms, had stopped participating in Dia de los Muertos celebrations, had even stopped making the simple Mexican dishes she had learned at my side throughout her childhood. The transformation of my vibrant, proud daughter into this quiet, apologetic version of herself had been heartbreaking to witness. Sophia, who had once danced folklorico with passion and spoken Spanish with the musical cadence of her ancestors, now moved through her expensive house like a stranger, speaking in the carefully modulated tones that David found acceptable. "You know what your problem is, Isabel?" David continued, warming to his theme as he always did when he had an audience for his cultural superiority lectures. "You're stuck in the past. You keep trying to force these outdated traditions on everyone, instead of adapting to modern life. This is America, not some village in Mexico. People here have evolved beyond eating brown sauce that takes all day to make." I felt tears pricking at the corners of my eyes, but I refused to give David the satisfaction of seeing me cry. This mole recipe is over 100 years old, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the trembling in my chest. It was created by my great-grandmother who learned it from— Nobody cares about your great-grandmother, David interrupted with the casual cruelty that had become his trademark when discussing my family's history. Dead people and their recipes aren't going to help anyone in the 21st century. What matters is adapting to current market demands, understanding consumer preferences, creating products that people actually want to buy. He gestured around his expensive kitchen with its professional-grade appliances and designer finishes. Look at what I've built for Sophia, this house, this lifestyle, this success. You think any of that came from clinging to the past? No, it came from understanding that tradition is just another word for being behind the times. Sophia remained silent throughout this exchange, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she gripped her water glass as if it were an anchor. My daughter was trapped between two worlds, the one she had been born into and the one she had married into, and David had made it clear which one she was expected to choose. "Mom," Sophia said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "maybe next time you could make something simpler. You know David prefers lighter flavors." The betrayal in those words was worse than anything David had said. This was my daughter, the little girl who had stood on a step stool beside me, learning to grind chilies and toast spices, now apologizing for the very traditions that had shaped her childhood. I looked at Sophia and saw not the confident young woman I had raised, but a stranger who had learned to be ashamed of her own heritage. I began clearing the plates in silence, wrapping the untouched mole in containers, while David launched into a detailed explanation of why ethnic restaurants failed in upscale markets. According to him, customers wanted fusion, not authentic, accessible, not traditional, modern interpretations, not grandmother's recipes. The problem with places like that little Mexican joint down on 24th Street, David said, clearly enjoying his role as cultural authority, is that they refuse to evolve. They keep serving the same heavy, old-fashioned food that their grandmothers made, and then they wonder why they can't attract customers beyond their own ethnic community. He was talking about Corazón del Pueblo, the small restaurant owned by the Herrera family, where I had been working part-time for the past 6 months. The Herreras had hired me to help with their traditional recipes after their previous cook had moved back to El Salvador. It wasn't glamorous work. I helped prep vegetables, stirred large pots of beans, and shared the techniques I had learned from my mother and grandmother. But it had given me a sense of purpose during the long days when Sophia was too busy with her new life to spend time with me. "That place will be closed within a year," David continued, with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his own opinions. "Nobody wants to eat that peasant food when they can get real Mexican fusion at places like Estrella or Nopalito. Those restaurants understand how to take Mexican flavors and make them sophisticated, approachable for people with refined palates." As I loaded the dishwasher, I thought about the irony of David's predictions. Corazón del Pueblo was indeed struggling, but not because their food was inferior. The Herreras were facing the same challenges that had driven dozens of family-owned restaurants out of the Mission District over the past decade: rising rents, gentrification, and the arrival of trendy establishments that served watered-down versions of traditional dishes at 3 times the price. But David saw the Herreras' struggle as vindication of his philosophy rather than evidence of a deeper problem with how authentic culture was being commodified and displaced. To him, their potential failure proved that tradition was worthless unless it could be repackaged for mainstream consumption. That night, after Sophia and David had retired to their master suite, I sat in their guest room, looking out at the glittering lights of the bay, and made a decision that would ultimately transform all our lives. I was tired of being treated like an embarrassment, tired of watching my daughter erase herself to please a man who had no respect for where she came from. I was tired of listening to David's lectures about the worthlessness of traditions he had never bothered to understand. Most importantly, I was tired of watching him profit from destroying the very authenticity that gave ethnic cuisine its soul, while simultaneously mocking the people who had created and preserved that authenticity for generations. David thought my great-grandmother's mole recipe was worthless peasant food that no sophisticated person would want to eat. He was about to discover just how wrong a restaurant consultant could be when he had confused his own prejudices with actual market knowledge. I had a plan forming in my mind, one that would give David a chance to see traditional Mexican cuisine through different eyes. He claimed to be an expert on what modern consumers wanted, what would succeed in today's market, what represented the future of ethnic dining. I was about to put that expertise to the test in a way he would never see coming. By the time I fell asleep that night, I had decided to show David that sometimes the oldest recipes hold the greatest value, and that dismissing tradition as worthless was not just cruel, it was also very, very bad for business. "That place will be closed within a year," David continued, with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his own opinions. "Nobody wants to eat that peasant food when they can get real Mexican fusion at places like Estrella or Nopalito. Those restaurants understand how to take Mexican flavors and make them sophisticated, approachable for people with refined palates." As I loaded the dishwasher, I thought about the irony of David's predictions. Corazon del Pueblo was indeed struggling, but not because their food was inferior. The Herreras were facing the same challenges that had driven dozens of family-owned restaurants out of the Mission District over the past decade: rising rents, gentrification, and the arrival of trendy establishments that served watered-down versions of traditional dishes at 3 times the price. But David saw the Herreras' struggle as vindication of his philosophy rather than evidence of a deeper problem with how authentic culture was being commodified and displaced. To him, their potential failure proved that tradition was worthless unless it could be repackaged for mainstream consumption. That night, after Sophia and David had retired to their master suite, I sat in their guest room, looking out at the glittering lights of the bay, and made a decision that would ultimately transform all our lives. I was tired of being treated like an embarrassment, tired of watching my daughter erase herself to please a man who had no respect for where she came from. I was tired of listening to David's lectures about the worthlessness of traditions he had never bothered to understand. Most importantly, I was tired of watching him profit from destroying the very authenticity that gave ethnic cuisine its soul, while simultaneously mocking the people who had created and preserved that authenticity for generations. David thought my great-grandmother's mole recipe was worthless peasant food that no sophisticated person would want to eat. He was about to discover just how wrong a restaurant consultant could be when he had confused his own prejudices with actual market knowledge. I had a plan forming in my mind, one that would give David a chance to see traditional Mexican cuisine through different eyes. He claimed to be an expert on what modern consumers wanted, what would succeed in today's market, what represented the future of ethnic dining. I was about to put that expertise to the test in a way he would never see coming. By the time I fell asleep that night, I had decided to show David that sometimes the oldest recipes hold the greatest value, and that dismissing tradition as worthless was not just cruel, it was also very, very bad for business. Miguel was quiet for a long time, studying the menu ideas I had outlined. Finally, he looked up with the expression of a man who had nothing left to lose. "What do you need from me?" "Complete control over the dinner menu for 4 weeks. A small budget for specialty ingredients, and most importantly, your promise that you won't panic and try to change things if the first week is slow." We shook hands on the deal, and I spent the rest of the day planning what would become the most important month of my culinary career. The first week's menu would feature my great-grandmother's mole poblano, the same recipe David had mocked so cruelly the night before. If I was going to prove him wrong, I might as well start with the dish he had found most ridiculous. But I had a secret weapon that David couldn't have anticipated. 3 years earlier, I had attended a food writing workshop at City College, where I had learned about the power of storytelling in culinary presentation. I understood that sophisticated diners weren't just buying food, they were buying experiences, narratives, connections to something authentic and meaningful. Each dish on our new menu would come with its story. Diners would learn about the convents where nuns had perfected mole recipes over centuries, about the indigenous ingredients that had been cultivated for thousands of years, about the families who had preserved these techniques through generations of hardship and displacement. More importantly, I had been watching the restaurant scene in San Francisco for months, and I had noticed something that David, for all his expertise, had missed. There was a growing movement of young, educated diners who were specifically seeking authentic experiences. Food bloggers were writing about grandmother's recipes and traditional techniques. Cooking shows were featuring authentic ethnic cuisine as the next big trend. David had been so focused on sanitizing Mexican food for mainstream palates that he had missed the emerging market of consumers who wanted exactly the opposite. Food that was unapologetically traditional, complex, and challenging. My plan had a second phase that I hadn't shared with Miguel yet. I was going to invite David to review the restaurant anonymously, without revealing my involvement. If my theory was correct, if traditional Mexican cuisine properly presented could succeed in the current market, then David would unknowingly validate the very traditions he had spent years mocking. That evening, I called my cousin Elena, who worked as a food blogger for several Bay Area publications. Elena had been writing about the Mission District's changing food scene for years, documenting both the loss of traditional establishments and the arrival of upscale, Mexican-inspired restaurants. "Isabel, what you're describing sounds incredible," Elena said when I explained our concept. "There's definitely an audience for this kind of authenticity, especially if you can present it in a way that helps people understand what they're experiencing." "Would you be willing to write about it?" I asked. "Not immediately, but maybe after we've had a chance to work out any problems?" "Absolutely. But Isabel, you need to understand, if this works, if you can pull off what you're describing, it's going to challenge a lot of assumptions about what Mexican food can be in this city. Are you prepared for that kind of attention?" I thought about David's dismissive comments, about Sophia's silence, about all the times I had been made to feel ashamed of my heritage and my knowledge. "I'm prepared," I said. The next 3 weeks were the most intense of my working life. Miguel and I completely transformed the restaurant's dinner service, training the existing staff on new dishes, sourcing ingredients from specialty suppliers, and creating the kind of detailed preparation schedules that professional kitchens require for complex traditional cooking. My great-grandmother's mole became the centerpiece of our first week, but we didn't just serve it as a sauce over chicken. We presented it as the star of a 7-course tasting menu that included handmade tortillas, traditional accompaniments, and even a small glass of the chocolate tea that had traditionally been served alongside mole in Puebla. Each course came with a printed card explaining its history and significance, turning dinner into an educational experience as well as a culinary one. We were asking diners to invest time and attention, not just money, in understanding what they were eating. On the night before our first service, as I stood in Corazon del Pueblo's kitchen, surrounded by pots of slowly simmering mole, I felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration. Tomorrow would determine whether my faith in traditional Mexican cuisine was justified, or whether David had been right all along about the worthlessness of old recipes in modern markets. Either way, I was about to find out whether the wisdom of generations could compete with the cleverness of consultants in the battle for sophisticated palates and critical acclaim. The first week of our new dinner service exceeded every expectation I had dared to harbor. Word spread quickly through San Francisco's tight-knit food community, and by Thursday night, we were completely booked through the following week. Food bloggers, restaurant critics, and curious diners had discovered what I had always known: that authentic Mexican cuisine, when prepared with skill and presented with respect, could compete with any culinary tradition in the world. "Isabel, I can't believe what's happening," Miguel said, as we watched the dinner service on our third night. The dining room was filled with an eclectic mix of customers: young tech workers who had driven down from South Bay, older couples from Pacific Heights, food writers scribbling notes between courses, and even a few chefs from other restaurants, who had come to see what the buzz was about. The mole poblano that David had mocked so cruelly was being received as a revelation by diners who had never experienced anything like its complex layers of flavor. The printed cards explaining the dish's history had turned each table into a small classroom, with customers reading aloud about the convents of Puebla and the indigenous ingredients that had been cultivated for centuries. But the real validation came on Friday night, when Elena published her review in the Bay Area food blog with a headline that made my heart race. Corazon del Pueblo serves the most authentic Mexican cuisine in San Francisco, and it's spectacular. Elena's review was everything I had hoped for and more. She understood not just what we were doing, but why it mattered. For too long, she wrote, San Francisco's Mexican food scene has been dominated by fusion concepts that prioritize accessibility over authenticity. Corazon del Pueblo's new dinner menu represents a radical departure from that trend, offering dishes that trust diners to appreciate complexity and tradition. She spent 3 paragraphs describing the mole alone, calling it a masterpiece of pre-Columbian culinary art that makes every other Mexican restaurant in the city seem like a pale imitation. She wrote about the stories that accompanied each dish, the careful sourcing of traditional ingredients, and the obvious skill required to execute such complex preparations. Most importantly, Elena understood the cultural significance of what we were attempting. This is not fusion food or modern interpretation, she concluded. This is the real thing, prepared by someone who learned these techniques from masters who learned them from masters before them. It's a direct connection to culinary traditions that many restaurants have abandoned in pursuit of broader appeal. The review brought immediate attention from the broader restaurant community. By the following Monday, we had inquiries from food, magazines, requests for chef interviews, and reservation requests from some of the most influential food critics on the West Coast. But the moment that truly vindicated my faith in the project came on Tuesday evening, when I watched a young couple in their 30s carefully taste each component of the mole course, their faces transforming as they experienced flavors they had clearly never encountered before. "This is incredible," the woman said to her companion. "I had no idea Mexican food could be this sophisticated. Why don't more restaurants serve food like this?" Her question was exactly what I had hoped people would ask. The answer, of course, was that most restaurants had been convinced by consultants like David that traditional Mexican cuisine was too complex, too challenging, too ethnic for mainstream success. They had been told to simplify, to fuse, to apologize for their authenticity instead of celebrating it. By the end of our second week, Corazon del Pueblo had a 2-week waiting list for dinner reservations. Miguel was hiring additional kitchen staff and expanding our ingredient sourcing to accommodate the demand. The financial turnaround was dramatic. In 2 weeks, we had generated more dinner revenue than the restaurant had typically earned. In 2 months. More importantly, we had proven that there was a significant market for authentic Mexican cuisine presented with skill and respect. Food lovers were willing to pay premium prices for dishes that challenged their palates and educated their understanding. They wanted stories, tradition, and connection to something real and meaningful. The irony of our success was not lost on me. David, the expert restaurant consultant who had built his career on elevating ethnic cuisine for mainstream appeal, had completely missed this market opportunity. While he had been busy sanitizing Mexican food to make it more palatable to people like himself, sophisticated diners had been developing an appetite for exactly the kind of authenticity he dismissed. On Thursday of our 3rd week, I received a phone call that made my heart skip a beat. Sophia was calling to tell me that David wanted to review our restaurant for a client who was considering investing in upscale ethnic concepts. "Mom, David heard about some Mexican restaurant in the Mission that's getting great reviews," Sophia said, sounding more animated than she had in months. He wants to check it out for a client, and he asked if I wanted to come along. Isn't that funny? He says it's probably just another fusion place trying to capitalize on the authentic trend. I kept my voice carefully neutral as Sophia explained that they had made a reservation for the following Friday, exactly 1 month after David had mocked my mole in their kitchen. That sounds wonderful, Mija. I hope you both enjoy the experience. After hanging up, I sat in my small kitchen, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was about to happen. David, the man who had built his reputation on dismissing traditional Mexican cuisine, was about to unknowingly review a restaurant whose success was built entirely on the recipes and techniques he had scorned. The mole poblano he would be served. On Friday night was made from the exact same recipe he had ridiculed as chocolate mixed with dirt. The only difference would be the presentation. Instead of being served on everyday plates in Sophia's kitchen by an embarrassing mother-in-law, it would be presented as part of an acclaimed tasting menu in a restaurant that food critics were calling revolutionary. I spent the week preparing for what I knew would be the most important service of my life. Every detail had to be perfect, not just the food, but the entire experience. David was coming to judge whether traditional Mexican cuisine could succeed in upscale markets, and I was determined to show him that the problem had never been with the food itself, but with his limited understanding of what sophisticated diners actually wanted. Miguel and I planned the evening carefully. David and Sophia would be seated at table 12, the corner booth that offered the best view of the open kitchen. They would receive the full 7-course tasting menu, with each dish prepared exactly as my grandmother and great-grandmother had taught me. The printed cards would tell the stories David had never bothered to learn, the stories that gave context and meaning to flavors he had dismissed as primitive. Most importantly, David would experience my great-grandmother's mole not as an embarrassing reminder of his wife's ethnic background, but as the centerpiece of a dining experience that other food experts had already recognized as exceptional. On Friday morning, as I prepared the complex mise en place required for our most ambitious service yet, I thought about the generations of women who had preserved these recipes through centuries of hardship and displacement. My great-grandmother, who had learned to make mole in the convents of Puebla, could never have imagined that her recipe would one day be served to San Francisco food critics and celebrated as high cuisine. But she had known something that David, for all his business acumen, had never understood: that food prepared with skill, love, and respect for tradition has a power that transcends cultural boundaries. Good food speaks to something universal in human experience, something that connects us to each other and to the generations who came before us. Tonight, David would taste that connection whether he recognized it or not. The question was whether he would have the humility to acknowledge that he had been wrong about everything, or whether his prejudices were too deeply ingrained to be overcome by mere excellence. Friday evening arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that only comes to San Francisco in November. As I stood in Corazon del Pueblo's kitchen, making final adjustments to the mole that had been simmering for 6 hours, I felt a mixture of anticipation and vindication that I had never experienced before. Tonight, David would unknowingly judge the very traditions he had spent years mocking, and the verdict would either confirm his expertise or expose the limitations of his understanding. At exactly 7:30, I watched through the kitchen's service window as Sophia and David were seated at table 12. Sophia looked elegant, but somehow diminished in her expensive designer dress, while David surveyed the restaurant with the clinical assessment of a professional evaluator. I could see him taking mental notes about the decor, the service, the ambiance, all the factors he would later analyze in his report to his client. What David couldn't see, of course, was that the woman he had humiliated just 4 weeks earlier was watching from the kitchen, preparing to serve him the meal that would challenge every assumption he had made about Mexican cuisine and its place in the fine dining world. The service began with our amuse-bouche, a single perfect bite of esquites, Mexican street corn, transformed into an elegant canapé that captured all the traditional flavors in a sophisticated presentation. I watched David's expression as he tasted it, noting the surprise that flickered across his face as flavors he had never associated with upscale dining revealed their complexity and nuance. Each course that followed built upon that initial surprise. The sopa de tortilla that had been dismissed by other consultants as peasant food was presented as a refined interpretation that maintained all its traditional elements while elevating the presentation to fine dining standards. The chile relleno, stuffed with a mixture of local cheese and herbs, demonstrated how traditional techniques could showcase premium ingredients without losing their cultural authenticity. Through it all, David examined each dish with increasing fascination. I could see him trying to categorize what he was experiencing, to fit it into his existing framework of what Mexican food could and should be. But these dishes defied his categories. They were undeniably traditional, yet sophisticated, complex yet coherent, challenging yet accessible to anyone willing to approach them with an open mind. The moment of truth came with the seventh course. My great-grandmother's mole poblano, the same recipe David had ridiculed in Sophia's kitchen exactly 1 month earlier. But tonight, it was presented as the climax of an acclaimed tasting menu, plated with artistic precision and accompanied by a detailed explanation of its history and cultural significance. I watched through the service window as David took his first bite, his expression transforming from professional skepticism to genuine amazement. This was the same man who had called my mole chocolate mixed with dirt, now experiencing it as the masterpiece it had always been when freed from the context of his own prejudices. "My God," I heard him say to Sophia, his voice carrying across the dining room. "This is incredible. I've never tasted anything like this complexity in a Mexican dish. The depth of flavor, the balance of sweet and savory, the way the chocolate integrates with the chilies. This is sophisticated cooking. At the highest level." Sophia nodded, though I could see confusion in her eyes. The mole David was praising with such enthusiasm was identical to the dish he had rejected so cruelly in their own kitchen. The only difference was the setting and his expectations. As the meal continued with traditional desserts and café de olla, I watched David's entire worldview about Mexican cuisine undergo a fundamental shift. This was a man who had built his career on the assumption that traditional ethnic food needed to be simplified and sanitized for upscale markets, now discovering that the opposite was true, that authenticity itself, when properly presented, was what sophisticated diners were seeking. After dinner, David asked to speak with the chef, a request that sent my heart racing. Miguel came to get me from the kitchen, and I walked out to table 12 with my pulse pounding, ready to reveal the truth about who had created the meal that had so impressed the expert consultant. "Chef," David began, rising from his seat, "that was one of the most extraordinary meals I've had in years. The mole in particular was a revelation. I had no idea that traditional Mexican cuisine could achieve that level of sophistication." I looked directly into his eyes, waiting for the moment of recognition. "Thank you. That mole recipe has been in my family for over a century. My great-grandmother learned it from the nuns at the convent of Santa Rosa in Puebla." David nodded, enthusiastically, still not recognizing me in the context of the restaurant kitchen. "Well, she was clearly a master. That recipe could be the foundation for an entire restaurant concept. Have you considered—" He stopped mid-sentence as recognition finally dawned, his face going pale as he realized who he was talking to. "Isabel," he whispered, looking back and forth between me and Sophia. You're the chef here?" "I'm the consultant who designed the dinner menu," I said calmly. "The same menu that features the mole recipe you found so disgusting in your own kitchen last month." The silence that followed was deafening. David stood frozen, processing the implications of what I had just revealed. Sophia covered her mouth with her hands, tears beginning to form in her eyes as she understood the magnitude of what had just happened. "The mole you just called sophisticated cooking at the highest level is identical to the dish you rejected. As chocolate mixed with dirt, I continued. The same recipe, the same techniques, the same ingredients. The only thing that changed was your willingness to taste it without prejudice. David sank back into his chair, the full weight of his hypocrisy finally hitting him. Isabel, I don't know what to say. You could start with an apology, I suggested. Not just to me, but to Sophia, who has spent 3 years being ashamed of her heritage because you convinced her it was worthless. What followed was the most honest conversation our family had shared in years. David, forced to confront the contradiction between his professional praise and his personal prejudice, began to understand how his attitudes had affected not just me, but Sophia and their marriage. He realized that his success as a consultant had been built on a fundamental misunderstanding of what authentic cuisine could achieve when presented with respect rather than apology. Sophia, witnessing this revelation, began to find her voice again, after years of silence. David, I've been hiding who I am because I thought you were ashamed of my background. But you just spent the entire evening celebrating the same traditions you made me feel bad about at home. The conversation continued long after the restaurant had closed, with David gradually acknowledging the damage his attitudes had caused and expressing genuine remorse for the pain he had inflicted. More importantly, he began to understand that his dismissal of traditional cuisine had limited not just his personal relationships, but his professional effectiveness. Isabel, he said finally, I need to ask you something. Would you be willing to work with me to help me understand authentic Mexican cuisine the way you've presented it here? I have clients who would pay tremendous amounts for this kind of knowledge. I looked at this man who had humiliated me and my culture, now asking for my help in understanding what he had previously dismissed. David, I'll consider working with you on one condition. You have to promise that you'll never again ask someone to be ashamed of their heritage or to sanitize their traditions for other people's comfort. He agreed without hesitation, and over the following months, David became one of the most effective advocates for authentic Mexican cuisine in the Bay Area restaurant scene. He used his consulting business to help traditional restaurants present their food with confidence rather than apology, and he became a vocal critic of the fusion trend that had dominated the market for so long. More importantly, Sophia began to reclaim her cultural identity, learning to cook traditional dishes again and sharing stories about our family's history with pride rather than embarrassment. Their marriage strengthened as David learned to appreciate rather than dismiss the heritage that had shaped the woman he loved. 6 months after that transformative dinner, Corazón del Pueblo had become one of the most acclaimed restaurants in San Francisco, with a 3-week waiting list and reviews in national food magazines. Miguel had expanded the business and hired additional staff, while I had become the most sought-after consultant for traditional Mexican restaurants throughout California. But the most meaningful change was in our family. David, the man who had once mocked my great-grandmother's recipes, now spent Sunday afternoons in my kitchen learning traditional techniques and asking about family food traditions. Sophia had begun teaching their children Spanish and cooking Mexican dishes with the same pride she had shown as a young girl. The mole recipe that David had dismissed as worthless peasant food became the foundation of a restaurant empire that celebrated rather than apologized for authentic Mexican cuisine. Food critics wrote about the cultural significance of traditional recipes, and young chefs began seeking out elderly women like me to learn techniques that had been passed down for generations. David's transformation from cultural critic to cultural advocate became a case study in how prejudice can blind even experts to quality and authenticity. He learned that sophistication isn't about sanitizing traditions, but about presenting them with the respect and skill they deserve. And I learned that sometimes the best way to prove someone wrong is simply to give them the opportunity to experience the truth for themselves, free from the prejudices that had previously clouded their judgment. The mole that had been ridiculed in a private kitchen became celebrated in a public restaurant, proving that context and respect can transform how we perceive even the most traditional dishes. Our family's story became a reminder that authentic traditions don't need to be apologized for or simplified. They just need to be shared with love, skill, and confidence in their inherent value. A year after that life-changing dinner service, I stood in the kitchen of Corazon del Pueblo's second location in Palo Alto, training a new generation of cooks in the traditional techniques that had once been dismissed as outdated. The restaurant group that David and Miguel had formed was revolutionizing how Mexican cuisine was perceived and presented throughout the Bay Area. "Abuela Isabel," called out Maria, one of the young cooks I was training. "Can you show me again how to achieve that perfect balance in the mole? Mine still doesn't have the depth that yours does." I smiled, remembering when Sophia used to ask me the same question as a little girl. "Patience, mija. The mole reveals its secrets slowly, but only to those who approach it with respect." David appeared in the kitchen doorway, no longer the arrogant consultant who had once mocked my cooking, but a humble student still learning to appreciate the complexity of traditions he had previously dismissed. "Isabel, the food critic from Bon Appetit, just finished her meal. She wants to interview you about the role of traditional recipes in contemporary dining." "Tell her I'll be happy to talk with her," I said, stirring the pot of mole that had been simmering since early morning. "But first, I need to taste this batch. My great-grandmother always said that each pot of mole is like a child. It needs individual attention to reach its potential." As I tasted the complex sauce that had sparked this entire transformation, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. What had started as a humiliating dinner in Sophia's kitchen had become a celebration of culinary traditions that were now being recognized and honored throughout the country. The recipe that David had once called worthless was now featured in cooking magazines and taught in culinary schools. Food Network had produced a documentary about traditional Mexican cooking techniques, with me as one of the featured experts. Young chefs from prestigious restaurants were traveling to learn from elderly women who possessed knowledge that couldn't be found in cookbooks. Most importantly, Sophia had reconnected with her heritage in a way that enriched rather than complicated her modern life. She had learned that being sophisticated didn't require abandoning her roots, but rather understanding their true value and sharing them with pride. "Mom," Sophia said, joining us in the kitchen after finishing her shift managing the front of house. "David's client from New York wants to open 5 restaurants based on our model. They're calling it the Authenticity Revolution in Mexican Cuisine." I laughed, remembering when authenticity had been seen as a liability rather than an asset. "And what did you tell them?" "I told them that authenticity can't be franchised," Sophia replied with a smile. "It has to be learned, respected, and earned, just like you taught me." David nodded in agreement. "We're recommending that they invest in training programs instead, bringing experienced cooks like you to teach traditional techniques to a new generation of chefs. That way, the knowledge spreads without being diluted." As the evening service began, I watched the dining room fill with customers who had come specifically to experience authentic Mexican cuisine prepared with traditional techniques. These weren't people seeking exotic novelty or sanitized fusion. They were sophisticated diners who had developed an appreciation for the real thing. The transformation was complete. David had evolved from a consultant who sanitized ethnic cuisine into an advocate who celebrated its authenticity. Sophia had reclaimed her cultural identity and learned to share it with pride. And I had discovered that the recipes passed down through generations weren't just family heirlooms. They were treasures that could change hearts, minds, and entire industries when shared with skill and confidence. The mole that had once been mocked as peasant food was now recognized as a masterpiece of culinary art. The traditions that had been dismissed as outdated were now celebrated as timeless. And the family that had been divided by prejudice was now united by a shared appreciation for the wisdom of our ancestors. As I served the last plate of mole poblano that evening, I whispered a silent thank you to my great-grandmother, whose recipe had not only saved a restaurant, but had also saved our family. Her legacy lived on, not just in the complex flavors of her sauce, but in the understanding that true sophistication comes from respecting and preserving the best of what came before. Us, the critics, were right. We had indeed started a revolution. But it wasn't a revolution against tradition. It was a revolution that celebrated tradition, honored its complexity, and refused to apologize for its authenticity. And it all began with a mole recipe that one arrogant consultant had foolishly dismissed as worthless, never knowing that it would ultimately teach him the most valuable lesson of his career.